Yeah. But again, if you end up needing more time, that's all right. And the smart books are new. They used to call it like a Learn Smart module. So at the end of the semester, I'll probably want to get y'all's perspective on those and if they were helpful or not. Alrighty, it's nice. So we'll go ahead and get started. If anyone is still having problems with the book with Connect, please make sure you let me know. If it's financial, please reach out to financial aid and see if they can help you. Just because I don't want y'all getting too far behind on the assignments, they would like build up and then at the end of the semester, I'll be like, this is so much. And it's like, it is, but if you got the chance to do it throughout the semester, it's not, I swear. So please be working towards having that, because those points do count throughout the semester. And unfortunately, sometimes in classes with assignments like this, people's grades will drop. They'll do great on the exams, they'll do great on the in-class assignments, and then at the end of the semester, when I go to put in final grades, their grade might drop from an A to a C because they didn't do the outline assignments, and those points add up pretty quick. So it's not like a threat or anything, it's just sort of like keep on top of stuff. The reason that we use those assignments is there's actually research that's been done by McGraw-Hill, your book publisher, that shows that these assignments help y'all to learn it and retain it better. We're not just torturing you, I promise. So, all right, today we have a couple things we're gonna do. We have a few more slides for our intro psych lecture. And then we are going to start on research methods. So before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and call roll. So Stephanie and Diego, Manny, Maria, Jasmine, Dawn, Sandy, Rita, Jordan, Nyla, Alexis, Kyle, Joe, Sadie, Demir, Taj, Nathan, Sebastian, Connor, Michelle, Chandler, Casey, Brooklyn, and Gabby, and then anyone I didn't call. I know we've got some people like switching around. All right, cool. There was a little bit of a hiccup with our night class version of intro. And so some of those folks are still getting that worked out and transferring into different sections, so. All righty, so we are going to spend just a few more minutes talking about careers in psych, and sort of what can you do with a degree in psychology. And just to let you know, these slides and the assignment you did, that was the career scavenger hunt. These are something that my seniors actually recommended to me. Because we teach a class for senior psych majors called Ethics and Professional Issues, where we really go in depth into every single career and maybe ethical issues you might run into related to that career. And a lot of them said to me, this is great, but we wish we had this way sooner. So that's one of the reasons why I've expanded our talk about careers in this intro course. So that those of you who are interested in going into psych as a major, as a career, start to find out all the different things you can do. I think a lot of people think psychology, you're going to do therapy. And certainly, as we'll see, a large portion of people who are in the psychological field, that is what they're doing. But there are so many other things you can do with this degree. So as you can see, I just mentioned people who are doing therapy. So you've got about a third of practicing psychologists who are in private practice, so they own their own business, do therapy that way. Another about 20% are in hospitals and clinics owned by somebody else, typically doing therapy. Sometimes you're doing research there as well. But then they're in other places as well. So colleges and universities are one of the largest employers of psychologists because you have people like me who are teaching. But then you also have folks like our counseling center staff, right, who are working in the field but working for psychology. We have a lot of folks who are in K-12 schools, career counselors, school psychologists, where you'd be testing kids for learning disabilities, ADHD, school therapists, school social workers are becoming more and more necessary, unfortunately, in this day and age. And then there are folks who work for businesses and governments. So in lots of surprising ways, there are psychologists, yeah, you would think, okay, they work at the VA, right? They're doing therapy. But there are also psychologists in a lot of different governmental organizations at the state and federal level, where they are doing research around policies, they are advising on implementing policies. The headquarters of the American Psychological Association is actually right in downtown DC. If you ever take the train to Union Station, the building is right near there. And that is on purpose because they are often going to lobby for mental health resources, research resources, on the Hill, going to the Capitol, talking to senators and representatives to try and get that. So for example, it was largely through the advocacy work of the APA and other psychologists that when the Affordable Care Act, what people call Obamacare, was passed, there's what's called mental health parity in there. It used to be, and some insurances still aren't great, but it used to be that like insurances just wouldn't cover therapy. They'd be like, I don't know, that's a different type of help. But part of the Affordable Care Act is that you've got to. So part of that came from the psychologists going and talking to members of our federal legislature to be like, this is important and here's why. These are the major research areas that people fall into. So you'll see a lot of folks are in developmental, where they're studying kids. We've got personality, cognitive is thinking and memory and things like that. Psychometrics is designing good measures that we can use to test for learning disabilities, to test for mental disorders, things along those lines. Physiological would be sort of that brain, body, mind interaction. Social is the interaction of the person and the environment. And then experimental is more broad. And then of course, there's always an other. And then these are the professional specialties. So people who are out doing applied psychology. So like I'm not technically doing applied psychology, right? I'm teaching y'all, but I'm not out there actually applying my psychology degree, working with people in the field. So the vast majority of those folks are clinical, doing therapy of some kind. Sometimes they're doing like large scale interventions or prevention programs, but they're out there. Counseling folks are there too. educational and school, and then that industrial organizational psych. This is where you can make a lot of money as a psychologist because you're within that corporate structure. And so psychology does have these unifying themes. Empiricism, it's empirical. We're going to be basing everything we do on research findings. So it's the premise that knowledge should be acquired through scientific observation. Psychologists conduct scientific research to test their ideas. They don't just sort of guess, right? It's also theoretically diverse. So for example, when we get to our personality chapter this semester, we'll see that like Freud had one idea about how things worked, but then Skinner had a different idea, and then someone like Rogers had a different idea, and there are different modern ideas, and that's considered okay within psychology. We like different theories because we can test them empirically, right, and get closer to truly explaining people's behavior. Theme 3 is that psychology and the other sciences are influenced in a socio-historical context. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we don't exist in a vacuum. We're not just doing research, and not being connected to the world around us. One of the things that I looked up today was, sort of what research is being done in psychology over the past couple of years. And I found an article listing like the top most read studies in 2023, and at least half of them have to do with social media, right? That's a big issue within our society, so we're studying that. If we didn't exist in a context where that happened, there would be no studies about social media. This also, unfortunately, sometimes means psychology has problems. So until the 1970s, homosexuality was listed as a disorder in the DSM. It was listed right next to pedophilia. Most psychologists are deeply ashamed that that was the case, but that was the socio-political context at that time. Even if you think back to the history we talked about, psychology as an applied field, rather than just sort of like a research thought project, really evolved because of the need for it during and after World War II, right? So we're really influenced by our context. This is also why you'll see sometimes we do not have very diverse samples, things along those lines. We also think that behavior is governed by a complex network of interacting factors. Why might you get a good grade in, say, this class? Some people would just say, oh, it's how smart I am. Well, that's part of it, right? But also study skills are going to come into play, your memory, your motivation to do well in this class, other stuff going on in your life, right? This morning I listened to a podcast from a few years ago where they interviewed a Ukrainian gymnast right after Russia invaded and started the war. And just like how difficult it was for him to concentrate being out on the competitive circuit, right? Knowing that like he doesn't know what's happening to his family back home. And then like his first competition after the invasion, he's on the podium, he wins, but he's on the podium next to a guy from Russia, and the guy from Russia wears a symbol of war, like tapes it to his coat on the podium, standing next to a Ukrainian. Like, what does that do to you, right? So that can be huge. Our behavior is also shaped by our cultural heritage, and culture is the widely shared customs, beliefs, values, norms, also institutions that we see, and those are transmitted socially across generations. Cultural factors shape our behavior and also influence how we interpret other people's behavior. One of the movies my daughter has been obsessed with recently is Elemental, which is on Disney Plus, if anyone has it, wants to watch it. And it's this idea that there are like people made of different elements, right? And like the fire people and the water people just do not understand each other culturally because they have totally different things. Like one of the fire people goes to visit the water people, they're like, oh, let's play the crying game after dinner. And she goes, oh, are you trying to cry? They're like, no, we're trying not to cry because I just cry at the drop of a hat. Whereas she's like, I've literally never cried, right? And societies and cultures aren't necessarily that extreme, but certainly we have influences, right? It's also influenced jointly by our heredity and our environment. We know that genes are part of things. We've known this since the time of Hippocrates. But we also know that genes are expressed in an environment. You could have all the genes in the world to develop clinical depression, but if your environment is supportive and you have generally positive experiences, you might never develop it. My favorite example of this for a non-psychological issue is, imagine someone has all the genes in the world to become 6'2", but they're denied adequate nutrition their whole life, right? They live in abject poverty. They can't always get food on the table. They might only end up being my height, which is 5'4", right? So our genes are expressed in our environment. And then theme 7 is that our experience of the world is very highly subjective. Motives, expectations, just interpretations of other things really influence this. And the scientific method is used to try to add as much objectivity as we can. And that's part of what we're going to start talking about in our research methods chapter. Again, give you an example of this. One of my colleagues yesterday was like, oh, I got this email from somebody and I feel like this is just really terse and rude. And I read it and I was like, this just feels like they're trying to help, right? But like her experience of interacting with that particular person is very different than mine. And so she's reading in a different way. And so one of the things I found on Instagram of all places a couple years back is this really helpful, what are all these different specialties within therapy? And so I'm just going to go through these slides real quick. So a psychiatrist is someone who gets an MD. They go to medical school. Just like your general surgeons, just like your primary care doc, just like a podiatrist, right? They all go to the same med school. And then afterwards, they will complete a residency. And this for psychiatry is 3 to 5 years. 3 if you're going into adult psychiatry, 5 if you're going into child psychiatry, because you got to learn what behaviors are normal at each age and which medicines are okay to give at each age, that type of thing. In modern times, the vast majority of psychiatrists are focusing on med management, prescribing medications, making sure it's going well. Which is ironic because psychiatrists like Freud and like some other folks we'll talk about throughout the semester, like Aaron Beck, actually founded a lot of talk therapies that we use today. But in modern insurance-based times, psychiatrists can usually get more of a reimbursement from insurance companies for a 20-minute med check than they can for an hour of therapy. So if you're a psychiatrist doing the math, you're like, well, I can get 2 or 3 times that in 1 hour, right? And so these folks often are working with some of these other therapists so that they can provide the talk therapy and they'll do the med management. Psychologists, when we hear someone declare they are a psychologist, technically they should be someone who's licensed in clinical or counseling psychology. The term is used more generally than that by sort of the lay public, but like technically, were I to go into some sort of business, I couldn't be like, oh, I'm a psychologist because I'm not licensed. I could say I have a degree in clinical psychology. Or I could call myself a psychological scientist. And so you can get a PhD, which is a doctor of philosophy in either clinical or counseling. Those are a little more nuanced. The main differences is counseling tends to be more holistic. It tends to incorporate more ideas about diversity and the whole person. Clinical tends to be very focused on like hard science. And then you like where you end up working can differ. So like clinical psychologists often end up working more in hospitals or VA settings, whereas counseling psychologists might be more likely to work in educational settings. And in fact, oftentimes counseling programs are housed in schools of education at major universities. There's also something called the PsyD, or the Doctor of Psychology. This is a fairly new, it's not that new anymore, but maybe like 30-year-old degree, and it is primarily focused on clinical training. So if you go to get a PsyD, you won't get training in research, but if you go to get a PhD, you will. So your PhD main focus again is research, but also your clinical work, and then testing and evaluation. The PsyD is going to be all the same, but not the research. In most states, psychologists do not prescribe medication. There are a couple of exceptions to this rule. So psychologists can get prescription privileges in a couple different states. Also, some psychologists in states without that will go and get, say, like a nurse practitioner degree, and then they can prescribe with that degree. Counselors, again, a term that you're supposed to use very specifically based on your degree. These folks often get a master's in education because, again, counseling programs are hosted under education schools. You'll also see various types of licensure here. So you could be a licensed mental health counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist, and these folks are getting trained to, and what they do is clinical work. And some will specialize. So like across town at EVMS, there's a program in art therapy. And so you use visual art mediums to get the client to express themselves more, or sometimes even like a treatment itself. So for example, let's say you have someone with obsessive compulsive disorder who doesn't like contamination, yucky things. You might ask them to work with clay in session so that they could see it's okay. But these folks are probably the majority of who's out there in the world actually doing therapy right now. Social workers are going to get a master's in social work. People who get the PhD are more likely going to want to be at a university teaching others about social work. It's not a program where there's a benefit to practice with a PhD, if that makes sense. So you'll see LCSW, licensed clinical social work. And the main difference with a social work program is that these folks learn more about connecting people to resources in the community. So they almost become like a case manager as well as a therapist. And again, you can have specializations here as well. So the term psychotherapist and therapist are umbrella terms that really mean mental health clinician. But sometimes you'll hear the term coach. So there are a lot of people out there now who call themselves life coaches or leadership coaches. That is not a protected term. You don't need to be licensed to use that term. Technically, anyone in this room right now could be like, I am now a life coach, and go make money doing it. I don't know how successful you'd be without a bachelor's degree, but you could do it. And so that's something important to know. If you see someone who's just advertising themselves as a coach, and you're trying to go to like get therapy, probably look elsewhere. And so here we have a little cartoon joking about dogs not being allowed on couches and the old type of psychotherapy where you laid on the couch. And so, as I mentioned, the main difference here is that you're going to get a PhD or PsyD to be a psychologist. To be a psychiatrist, you're getting that MD. Psychiatrists view mental health as the same as any other type of health. It's biologically based. Whereas psychologists tend to look at it more from like a biopsychosocial method. The psychiatrist can prescribe meds and admit patients for inpatient hospitalization. Whereas the psychologist's real emphasis is that we have above everybody else is we are trained in giving psychological tests. So we have that ability to do so. Sorry, I'm just getting some buzzes on my phone, so I'm making sure. I always like to make sure it's nothing wrong with my daughter, but just people asking questions. Alrighty, so now we're going to move over to talk about research, and before we do that, I wanted to just show you a couple things that have come up in just the past couple days for research in psychology. So this was a study that they looked at self-confidence and how you react to DMs and other text-based interactions online. It's very cool. And then this one was about charity donations, and they found that people who give at least 10% of their income to charity are more likely to score high on measures of morality and score high on measures of open-mindedness. Maybe that shouldn't be surprising, but sometimes we have to actually study it to see. Alrighty, so now we're going to start talking about research. Hey, there we go. And so, as I've mentioned a bunch of times, right? Psychology is a science. There's a reason why your book is, focusing on a scientific approach to psychology. And so we're going to start talking about how do psychologists do research. And in order to illustrate what this might look like in real life, instead of just talking about it in abstract ways, I'm going to use examples throughout this lecture. And I'm going to focus on the area of eating. And so you might be like, well, why are we talking about eating? A couple different reasons. My research focuses on body image disturbance and disordered eating behavior. So this is near and dear to my heart. So it's easy for me to come up with examples. And then the second and maybe more important reason is everyone can relate. We all eat, usually every day, right? So we all have experience with consuming food and the emotions and other things that may be wrapped up in that. So research is really critical in general for advancement of knowledge. And these are some of the quotes I like to use to illustrate that. So Aristotle, back in the 4th century, said, the brain is an organ of minor importance. They used to think it was like the heart that thought and the liver where your emotions were. So if you've ever read Shakespeare, sometimes he'll talk about like the liver being involved in heartbreak and things like that. I realize I'm making liver, it's over here, not like here. Liver gestures. And so even the ancient Egyptians, who did write the first psychological text, believed the brain was unimportant. So if you know anything about Egyptian death processes, they mummified folks and they would preserve their organs in these like clay jars. They did not preserve people's brains. People were already dead. I want to share clear with it. But they pulled the brains out through the nose and just threw them away. So, if we had just sort of stopped there, we wouldn't know a lot of what we know today about thinking and feeling and things along those lines. But it obviously goes beyond psychology. So in 1899, Charles Duell, who worked at the US Patent Office, said, everything that can be invented has been invented. Okay, right? Well, probably wrong about that, right? A lot of things have been invented since then. But at that time, from his socio-historical perspective, that's what he believed, right? And thank goodness other people said, let's keep thinking about this. And in 1977, Ken Olsen from Digital Equipment Corporation said there's no reason for any individual to have a computer in their home. Now, granted, 1977, a computer would have been the size of this room, right? Like one computer. My grad advisor, who I believe started working around the time I was born in the 80s, so she was getting her PhD in the 70s, has told me stories about how she would have to schedule time with the computer to run her statistics. because there was like a computer on campus. There was one. And so she's like, yeah, I'd go from midnight to 2 a.m. because no one else wanted to be there then. And it was great. And that's when they used punch cards. Right. And so probably at that time, there's no way that Ken Olsen would have imagined that we would all hold computers in our hands, right? And that these would have more computing power than the Apollo missions did that took the astronauts to the moon, right? That technology was just something of sci-fi back then. So we didn't get flying cars yet, but we did get these. So I don't know, 6 of one, half dozen the other. So what the heck is research? Research is the systematic search for facts through the use of careful observations and investigations. So we're searching for facts. Some people will call these truths, right? We're trying to discover concrete information. And only by rigorously testing theories or techniques on a representative group of participants can psychologists actually evaluate how accurate those theories are or how helpful those techniques might be. This can be especially tricky for clinical researchers and other applied researchers within psychology because we study people and we study ways to try to treat or help people. And people are very complex, right? It's not like we're studying, I don't know, like a rock. I don't want to downplay rocks. They're also beautiful and complex, right? Love geology. But like, we can pretty much know all the quantities of a rock pretty quickly, right? We can't know that about humans. There are some things about humans we just can't ever know with the technology we have right now. Some of the challenges for these applied researchers include things like trying to measure unconscious motives. If it's unconscious for the person we're studying, how on earth are we supposed to measure it, right? They can't tell us, they don't know. And then thinking about assessing private thoughts, right? There are times people don't want to tell us what they're thinking about. Sometimes they tell us really surprising things. There was a study, I want to say it was in the 80s, where it was like an absurd amount of college students. I want to say it was like 70% were like, yeah, I'd sexually assault someone if I could and get away with it. Whoa, who am I living and walking around, right? And you'd hope that things have changed since then, but sometimes they tell you stuff that you're shocked about. And then also things like monitoring mood changes. When does your mood go from okay to okay, now I'm a little happy, right? Or now I'm a little sad. So all these different things create challenges within the realm of psychological research. So we have to rely on the scientific method. Science is the pursuit of systematized knowledge through observation. And that observation can vary depending on the field of science, right? So in some cases, you're looking through a microscope. In other cases, you're getting readings off of a particle accelerator. In our case, you're often directly observing people's behavior, or you're getting answers to questionnaires, things along those lines. So, as in all areas of research, we are trying to systematically gather and evaluate information. And we do that through very careful observation of the phenomena around us, or the phenomena we're trying to study. So the objectives of science include description, right? So initially in biology, it was let's describe these animals and plants. So there's some of that still going on. We're still like discovering new species, which I think is so cool. But in psychology, that might be a description of a mental disorder or a personality trait, right? or a technique that we're going to try to use. Prediction. We want to predict what the outcome will be, not only for science's sake, but also for safety's sake, right? I don't know how much you all follow the news, right? But there was a school shooting, and apparently in Georgia, and apparently the young man who did the shooting has been asking for mental health care for a year. But I don't know if his parents didn't believe in it. There are still people who don't believe therapy is a thing, right? He did not receive that help. Unfortunately, we could have predicted something would erupt. We might not know it was this way, right? We also might want to predict, is therapy going to help, right? If we put someone in therapy, is that going to actually help them feel better? Well, we sure hope so, right? But we need to make sure techniques are actually helpful. Sometimes stuff that we think is great isn't great. So for example, mindfulness, using meditation and things along those lines is a big thing within therapy now. And for a lot of people, that's helpful. But for a subset of people with certain disorders, it's actually harmful, right? So we want to make sure we're not trying to apply that technique in a case where it's going to not be helpful and sometimes actually be the opposite, right? Sometimes we want to try to control things. Maybe we want to control all the variables that can be controlled in our study so that we get the cleanest result possible. Sometimes we're trying to control people's behavior, right, in different ways. There's a reason propaganda is a thing, right? Even stuff we might not think of as like propaganda because it's very positive. If you think about like during World War II, Rosie the Riveter and people being encouraged to have victory gardens, right? All that I'm sure had like some psychological or sociological research behind it in terms of like what's the best way to market and, you know, influence or control people in the direction we want them to. And then understanding, I think this is the biggest thing in science in general, and of course in psychology, is we want to understand psychological disorders, just why people act the way they are, why people might have memory issues, why the brain does certain things. It's almost like a little kid, right? If any of you have little siblings or a babysat, right? And they're just like, why? Why? My daughter's in this phase right now. But why? I don't know, man. Sometimes I don't know. And I tell her that she is not satisfied. She has the mind of a scientist, I think. So this is like psychology and science in general is always like, why? Let's find out why. Let's understand why this is happening. What we're looking for within a scientific context is a nomothetic understanding. That's just a fancy word for definitional or broad understanding. So we're not necessarily trying to understand like one person or one animal. We're trying to understand this idea as a whole and how it might apply broadly. And that's what nomothetic means. So psychologists, as I've mentioned, use the scientific method to obtain scientific evidence. And this has, you can break it into many different steps, but at its core, it's really 3 steps. And the first one is you're going to formulate a testable hypothesis. What does that mean? It means you're going to ask a question. Come up with something that you want to see. How is this going to influence things? What is that going to result in? It's a tentative statement of the relationship between 2 variables or 2 aspects of a person. Oftentimes, your own observations or thoughts about things might generate research questions. Sometimes you'll get that from doing literature searches and seeing what other people have done. Then you're going to gather appropriate data. Oh, I actually had a little definition for you guys there. Okay. You're going to gather appropriate data to actually test that hypothesis. And then part of that is when you get the data, you're going to use statistics to analyze your findings. We're gonna talk about a lot of different research methods that psychologists use to test these various findings. And the results of your data analysis will either support your hypothesis or refute or fail to support your hypothesis. And then a big part of science that a lot of people sort of forget about is reporting your findings. So how are you going to tell other people what you found out? A lot of times within psychological science, we're doing this in very like niche ways, I would say. We're telling other psychologists about it. So like I go to a big conference in November and I will be presenting research I conducted as part of a panel of other people who have similar research, and other psychologists will come and watch and ask us questions, right? And that gives us ideas for future research, but it also gives them information about that. Or we might write it up into a scientific article that would get published in a journal. More and more people are trying to figure out, how do I report beyond just the psychological community? Right, so journals themselves will often put out press releases. Some journals have podcasts where they talk with the authors about the studies to try to make it more accessible to people. A lot of psychologists are really trying, and like scientists in general, are really trying to figure out how to communicate their findings via social media. And this is called science communication. It is a thing you are not taught in grad school. I mean, maybe they're starting to teach it now, but I certainly was not taught this in grad school. When really interesting people are starting to take notice of this. So for example, Hank and John Green, who have the company that makes things like Crash Course, they've started an internship within their company for scientists to learn how to be science communicators. So like they just had their first intern. They did a video with her where she was talking about sharks because she's a shark scientist. And as someone who knows a lot about sharks, because my 6-year-old is obsessed with sea life, I still learn stuff. Whale sharks have teeth on their eyes, like sort of mind blowing. Like there are covers on their eyes that are made up of the same stuff as teeth, right? That is a fun fact I did not know prior to watching that. And that's something that sticks with you, right? All right, so let's think about eating and how we can make a study about that. So why do people eat? Why do you guys eat? Necessity. Necessity. Hey, you gotta do it. A lot of reasons. Energy. Yeah, food is fuel, right? This is something we would often tell our clients who have fears about eating. What are some other reasons you could eat? Stress is a huge one. I am a stress eater. Yeah.
Disease, I guess you could say.
Yeah. So let's say you have a tapeworm, right? You're going to eat more than usual because you're feeding that tapeworm. Hunger. Oh, it's social, right? You go out with your friends to have dinner, or you go to the calf together. It's often celebratory, right? You have an achievement. Let's go out to celebrate, and that often includes food. Related to stress, some people just eat when they're bored. Some people eat as like a self-care tactic. And some people will eat to avoid things like stress and other negative emotions. And this is something that we study a lot within the field of eating disorders. So people that binge eat, and if you're not familiar with binge eating, it's eating a large amount of food in a short amount of time with a sense of loss of control. Some people will just subjectively binge, where they might eat what's actually a normal amount of food, but they feel like it's too big. Some people will engage in what we call objective binging, where they might eat 2, 5, 10,000 calories in one sitting. Yeah, it's impressive. And so our hypothesis is that people who binge eat will be more likely to binge eat in response to negative moods than neutral moods. And so we're going to use this hypothesis to see how different methods, different research methods might test this throughout the semester. And one thing I should say real quick before we go on is binge eaters do this repeatedly and as part of their pathology. We all probably binge at some point during the year. There's a culturally sanctioned binge in November, right? It's called Thanksgiving, right? And sometimes athletes will binge, but they have to fuel. So I had a student a while back who was from the same town in Maryland as Michael Phelps. And he would come into her restaurant that she worked as a waitress the day before a meet, and he would sit and eat 10,000 calories, but he needed to fuel all the racing he was going to do the next day. So just sort of pointing out that not all binging is pathological in and of itself. So a case study is like the simplest and first technique in psychological research. It provides a detailed interpretive description of one person's life and psychological issues. It can serve as inspiration for new ideas, for future research. So Freud based all of his theories on case studies. And it's a good inspiration for future research because it could offer tentative support for a theory. It could challenge the assumptions of an existing theory. It can inspire new therapeutic techniques. And it could offer opportunities to study unusual problems. There's a case study that Freud did, a little boy named Little Hans. Now, really interestingly, Freud typically worked with adults, but this was one of the rare exceptions where he worked with a kid. And he was a young boy afraid of horses. And Freud decided that little Hans's fear of horses was linked to his Oedipal complex, which we'll talk about later in the semester, but it's a really messed up idea that little boys are attracted to their moms. And Freud saw the fact that little Hans had once seen a horse fall in the street right next to him and was terrified by this as insignificant. Another prominent example is Alois Alzheimer. In the early 1900s, he described a patient exhibiting symptoms of forgetfulness, disorientation, and a decline in level of functioning. That became known as Alzheimer's disease. So an example in our area of eating, and I don't think I have a slide for this, but would be, you would interview a woman who's presenting problem for therapy as binge eating. You would take a long history of her life. What's her eating pattern been over time? Maybe she tells you that when she was growing up, she lived with her mom and her grandma. Her mom worked outside the home. Her grandma was who she came home to after school. And her grandma loved to bake. And whenever the little girl came home feeling sad or depressed, the grandmother would bake and put the plate in front of her and say, eat, you'll feel better. This is like, whenever I read this example, I think of my Polish grandmother who sadly passed away, but she was forever like, eat. And so as a psychologist, you start thinking, okay, so when she was a child, she basically learned that whenever she was feeling bad, you eat, and that's how you cope. So that could be her basis for binging now. Imagine there's some limitations to the case study technique, so there could be bias on the part of the observer or even the person, the client, the reporter. So for example, little Hans's father was a huge fan of Freud. He had read Freud books. And so he tended to report information that supported Freud's theory and ignore or de-emphasize information that did not. You're relying on subjective evidence rather than objective things. And so this creates what's called low internal validity, which is accuracy with which you can rule out any other possible causes, right? In the case of the little girl, there could be other stuff that went on around food for her, right? Or it could be something more recent. Case studies also provide little to no basis for generalization. Right? You can't take something from one person and apply it to the whole population. That's called low external validity, which is the degree to which you can apply those results to other people. All right, I wanted to get to the slide today because I know my correlation does not imply causation, sure. Correlation is looking at the relationship between or among two or more variables. And people are real good in the media taking correlational results and implying they're causal. So my shirt is looking at ice cream sales and shark attacks, and they do tend to correlate. So when ice cream sales go up, so do shark attacks. What might be a third variable causing both those things to go up?
Location,
What's that?
location,
Location is a huge one, if you live near the beach. Also, when do you tend to eat more ice cream? Summer, right? So both these things go up in the summer. Because you're swimming more and it's hot, so you eat more ice cream, right? This is an example of what's called a spurious correlation. It looks like one thing might cause each other another, but in fact, there's a third variable that's pretty obvious, summer, right? Causing it, and sometimes there are third or fourth or fifth things that are not so obvious causing it. So we will return to correlations on Monday and really get into these. But great week this week, and I hope everybody has a good weekend, although the weather is supposed to be crummy. Right?